Okay, this is the Spanish-American War, 11-6. When is war justified is the essential question. These are the causes of the Spanish-American War, and like the web quest that you've already looked at, the video that we watched, a lot of Americans are sympathetic towards businesses that we have in Cuba, specifically sugar. Mass media and yellow journalism, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, publishing sensational stories and basically lying about what's going on in Cuba in order to sell paper, but then also the explosion of the Maine. The DeLome letter would have also been something that would have pushed Americans towards war or support of war. But these are the ones that are typically considered the main three causes. So we have war during the Spanish-American War. We have war going on in two places. We have Cuba and we have the Philippines. Both Cuba and the Philippines are trying to get their independence from Spain. So the United States is going to help both of those two countries get their independence. How we deal with them when that's over is a little different. So the Maine blowing up, the USS Maine, is what's going to get us into Cuba specifically. Conditions are bad in Cuba. Most of our troops that end up dying are dying from illness as opposed to actually fighting. And then we also had TR in there where he's fighting with the Rough Riders, which was a diverse group of volunteers. In the Philippines. So the main battle that takes place in the Philippines is with the destruction of the Spanish fleet, which happens in about 3 hours. Our naval guy, George Dewey, is able to go over there, find the fleet, and basically take them all out. The leader of the Filipino nationalists is Emilio Aguinaldo. And again, we help the Philippines become independent from Spain. So this is a turning point in our foreign policy. John Hayes, Secretary of State at the time, calls it a splendid little war because the war only lasts about 3 months. So what are we going to end up doing with the colonies that we take or we eventually gain from Spain? Are we going to give them independence? Are we going to keep them for ourselves? Or do we make some kind of situation where we're going to work towards their independence? Another reason why this is a turning point in foreign policy is because of the amount of colonies that are no longer controlled by Spain. So Spain's going to give up Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. We like Guam because it's in the middle of the Pacific. It's another place where we could stop, a coaling station on our way to the Far East. There are differing points or differing views on expansion. On the left-hand side, you have President McKinley. He would have been in favor of imperialism or expansion in general. He believed that we would be civilizing, educating, uplifting groups that were inferior to us. So the Cubans, the Puerto Ricans, the Filipinos, for example. He also liked the idea of how expansion would help us trade with China. And other nations would control if we weren't. So in other words, if the United States didn't do something, Spain would go in and do something, or France would go in and do something, Great Britain would do something. We needed to be able to get out there for ourselves. On the other side, the against, we're talking about William Jennings Bryan, who seems like he won't go away. But he believed it was a crime against our principles of government. And he was part of the American Anti-Imperialist League, of which they said it was inhumane, it was expensive, and it would end up costing American lives. So what we end up doing with Cuba, and you can kind of see Cuba here in the background. Here's the capital city of Havana, and then here's Florida, or the southern tip of Florida, the United States. We create the Platt Amendment, which is going to essentially mean that the United States can internally and externally influence what's going on in Cuba. For example, they can't make a treaty unless the United States has overseen that treaty or agreed to that treaty. We want to be the ones that have economic influence on Cuba. We don't want it to be another imperialistic country that's doing that. The other thing is U.S. naval bases, specifically in Guantanamo Bay, which is going to be down here. We want to be able to make sure that we can control that area of the Caribbean as well as Puerto Rico. In the Philippines, so the map to the right, you can see the Philippines is located right here, just south of China. This area right here is Japan. We're interested in the Philippines because of a number of natural resources that it has, but we're going to decide to keep the Philippines. So again, we help get rid of the Spanish, and then instead of making the Philippines independent, we decide that we're going to take over. Aguinaldo, that guy, he's going to end up leading an insurrection, which is a rebellion against the United States. They use guerrilla warfare, of which they're very successful. The United States puts people in not necessarily concentration camps, but we're going to put them in camps so that we know where they're at and we can kind of control the amount of guerrilla warfare that's going on. We also kill and burn villages and fighters that were part of the rebellion, so we're not necessarily not our finest moment. In 1901, Aguinaldo is going to be captured, and that essentially will end the rebellion, and 5,000 Americans will have died. 200,000 Filipinos will have died, and $400 million was spent. In 1946, I believe it is, the Philippines end up finally getting their independence. I don't know if you remember this guy, but he was the one that got stuck in the bathtub. He was a former president, or will, be a former or a president of ours. He ends up becoming governor of the Philippines. He censored the press and jailed opposition, which essentially means if you were against the United States, you couldn't speak out again. You couldn't say anything. While in the Philippines, William Howard Taft in the United States is going to help build infrastructure, which would be your schools, bridges, roads, that kind of thing. And then in 1916, the Jones Act is passed, which says eventually the Philippines will be able to gain their independence, which, like I said, happens in 1946. So now as the United States becomes more and more of a growing power, world power, I should say, public support for expansion is very high. They like the idea that we're taking over these different places for different reasons, whether it be military or economic. But we had to kind of just decide, did we want to develop an empire? How far did we want to be involved in world affairs? And what would our foreign policy look like moving forward? And as we talked about those three progressive presidents, each one is actually going to have a different idea of what that should look like.